Today on Physically Spiritual, I have the honor of talking with Dr. Matthew Breuninger. Welcome to Physically Spiritual. I've been amazed by how much growing physically healthier has changed my spiritual life. I'm captivated by discovering the truth about my body and how it reveals God. Physically Spiritual is my attempt to harmonize and share what I've discovered. I'm your host, Andrew Reinhart. Well, today on the show, I'm really excited to talk to Dr. Matthew Breuninger. He's an assistant professor of psychology at Franciscan University of Steubenville. He earned his MA in theology at Ave Maria University and a doctoral degree in clinical psychology from Baylor University. Dr. Breuninger is a licensed clinical psychologist. He is the founder of Wellspring Counseling and Coaching, the author of Finding Freedom in Christ, Healing Life's Hurts, and the host of Ask a Catholic Therapist on YouTube. Welcome to the show, Dr. Breuninger.
Thanks. I'm really grateful to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm just going to call you Matt from now on.
Please.
You told me to before the show. So I like to start every guest out with this question. You know, what we do in the church, what we do in ministry, I think it comes out of our lives and it comes from the story that God has written in our life. So I'm just curious, like, what did the Lord do in your life to bring you this space of working in mental health, but also integrating faith into mental health?
Yeah.
So like, most sons, I looked up to my dad and I wanted to be a counselor because he was a counselor. And at some point in high school, my faith dissipated and, became, for all practical purposes, non-existent. And as is often the case, not always, but as is often the case, with that came a whole bunch of bad decisions. And I was unanchored and unmoored to any morals and values. And I ended up hurting myself, certainly, with a lot of the choices I made and hurting other people. And so I went to college, was in college about 1.5 years and dropped out.
Wow.
I was just a mess. I had no purpose. I had no meaning. I had no plan. I wasn't able to focus. I wasn't disciplined in any way. I mean, it was a bad go of it. And so I dropped out, and it's really hard to describe it. I mean, life was just dark. It was just really dark. It was just a bad place, emotionally, spiritually. And one night I ended up on the doorstep of I had an aunt of mine who was sort of had a big conversion, was very religious, very Catholic, was a TOB speaker. And I kind of, tried to avoid her for the most part. When I was sort of at my worst. But then when I was really in my darkest place, I ended up on her doorstep one night. And she and her husband brought me in, and they really, in some ways evangelized me. But first they listened,
Yeah.
And they heard the struggle, and they heard the heartache, and they heard the pain, and they heard the searching, and they heard the fear and the loneliness. And then they began to introduce me to the faith, or reintroduce me to the faith. A faith that had teeth, a faith that had a capacity to touch these parts of my life that I didn't think faith could touch. And so they introduced me to the Blessed Mother, and I started praying the Rosary, and then, started going back to Mass, and went back to confession, and the Sacraments became a part of my life, and then introduced me to things like theology of the body. And my life really changed dramatically, just dramatically. And so I decided to transfer universities. I just felt like I'd kind of started off on the wrong foot at the original university. So I transferred universities, fell in with a great group of young people who were trying to live an authentic Catholic life. But I had switched from sort of being a psychology major. I thought, I don't know what I want to do. I think I'll be an English lit major. So I studied English lit. Sort of what I've always loved the most, even in literature, is sort of a character's story, a character's psychology.
Yeah.
And And so anyway, I went from that to, I started working for a judge, and I was working for a judge in this drug court program, which is essentially a program where you try to help people get sober and enter recovery using the court system as a behavioral stick. So rather than putting people in jail, you use jail as a way to encourage positive behavior.
Yeah.
But I was working with all these alcoholics and addicts. I was really interested in their stories and really interested in how psychology could play a role in recovery. But I also became really interested in recovery, this model of recovery, like the 12 steps. So many of them were in 12-step programs. And the heart of the 12 steps was this encounter. I mean, it fascinated me that the 12 steps said that by the time you go through these steps, what we can guarantee is that you will have had a spiritual experience profound enough to keep you sober. And that to me was like a bold claim.
Yeah.
And then I go to the appendix of this book, and it says, what is a spiritual experience? And it says that it is a radical shift in one's personality, in their attitudes, ideas, and behaviors. This deep psychological change. And so I got really interested in this sort of intersection of faith and psychology. And I ended up, interestingly, down in Belize visiting a friend, and I ran into this monk, and he was talking about reading St. Thomas Aquinas, and I was talking about reading Shakespeare. And the way he was talking about Aquinas made me want to read him. I thought, this sounds amazing. I hadn't been exposed to Aquinas at that point. And so I came home from that trip, and I decided I wanted to study theology. And sort of naively, I thought it was going to be more like catechetics. Yeah. This is what the church teaches. And I went to Ave Maria, and it was a theology program. It was not catechetics. It was deep theology. So it was good. It was like drinking out of a fire hydrant. But even in theology, what I was so interested in when we were reading St. Thomas, what I was really interested in, what are the sort of psychological components to some of these theological realities. So when we talk about virtue, in some ways, virtue is talked about in a way that, how do you become patient? Do patient things, like practice patience. How do you become courageous? Do courageous things. But then I start thinking, well, how do emotions serve as an impediment to that?
Yep.
How do our cognitions and maybe sort of faulty thinking or irrational thoughts impede this? To what extent do goals, sort of for goal-oriented creatures, to what extent does having clarified goals play a role in this? And the psychological dimension was really, really interesting to me. And how could we maybe even help people psychologically in order to help them advance spiritually? How does our past play a role in this? Does it shape how we think about virtue? Does it shape how we enact virtue? So anyway, I started thinking in this program, like, I really want to go back to psychology. But at this point, I have an English lit degree and I have a theology degree, and I kind of took a stab in the dark, and it was a really providential moment for me. But the way I ended up at Baylor and the lab I ended up in, I actually hadn't originally intended to be in this particular professor's lab, but he was one of the last interviews of the day. The guy who I went down there to study with, I didn't really click with. And so this guy said, look, I'm a neuroscientist by training, but I'm really interested in faith and psychology.
Yeah.
And I was like, I am too. And I said, look, I only want to come here, I only want to work with you. And so if I don't want to get into the program if I can't work with you. And 2 days later, he called and said, oh, we want to have you in the lab. And so I got to study, he was a devout Baptist. And he now actually, interestingly, runs a very large mental health. He left Baylor. He now runs a really large mental health clinic in Houston called the Hope and Healing Center. Really tries to thread the needle, sort of bringing empirically based psychology into contact with people of faith and the faith community. And it's a tremendous guy, a tremendous mentor, Dr. Matt Stanford. But man, he worked with me over the course of 3 or 4 years and just allowed me to begin to think about these things. Like, how do I think about this? And it was a space to think about it. And so, that for me, sort of academically, that's how I ended up in the space I'm in. But personally, wanting to bring some of that freedom that I've experienced, that real freedom. And I saw something in the 12 steps. I saw heroin addicts. I mean, men and women who were terribly addicted.
Yeah.
I saw them go from the pits of despair to being happy, joyous, and free. And that to me was shocking. Like, and I want to understand how that works, and I want to understand what role, like, how does God play a role in this? And how do the 12 steps maybe open or dispose one to this? And so I became really interested in the 12 steps and then trying to bring the 12 steps and the freedom it offers to other people. Because I thought there was a wisdom in them. So I devoured that book, just devoured it, and tried to implement some of the practices in my own life, and saw real changes. And so that for me was, I wanted to bring this to other people. So that's sort of how the book arose, and that's, and part of it is just it's vocation, man. It's this unique thing that God has given me that makes me fascinated in people and fascinated in their stories, and the ability to sit with really painful material, and the ability to sort of invite people to walk into it in such a way that they might begin to heal from it. I mean, part of it is just how God's made me. It's just, it excites me. It's the stuff that I get passionate about. It's the stuff I'm interested in. It's like, I have friends here in the philosophy department who the thought of sitting with, these are good men and women, but the thought of sitting with somebody who's sharing their deepest, darkest pain, I mean, it's just like horrifying and overwhelming to them.
Yeah.
I just, feel really comfortable there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's a little bit of my story, man. Yeah.
There's a priest of our diocese, Father Mark Davis, said something once that struck me, and this was commenting that different ages have different spiritualities that kind of mark them. I have like a school of spirituality that arose, and you only kind of notice it after the fact. And he kind of opened the question up, well, what would our age's unique contribution to the spiritual tradition be? And he said, I think the 12 steps are going to be our age's sort of contribution. So that really piqued my interest. On the show soon, in the next year or so, I'm going to be doing a whole series on addictions.
That's awesome.
So I'm kind of doing a deep dive right now to go with my previous studies and work with it. So
yes.
So you're speaking my language.
Yeah.
And,
some deeply Catholic stuff. Bill Wilson, the founder of NA, almost entered the Catholic Church. He was receiving instruction under Archbishop Fulton Sheen. And he just couldn't, I think it was papal infallibility. He couldn't get over papal infallibility. But he had a real soft spot for the Catholic Church. His sponsor was actually a Jesuit priest. And there's letters between he and this priest, Father Ed Dowling, the priest. Dawn Eden is writing a book. I don't know if it's out yet. It's either out or it's soon to be out on Father Ed Dowling. Fascinating creature, but fascinating man. But Bill Wilson, if in the 12 steps, there's this fascinating step where you have to admit all of the wrongs that you've done to God, yourself, and another human being. And there's actually a line in there that's sort of often missed. And it says, for those of us who belong to a denomination that requires confession, we will want to and must seek out the appropriate authority. Sort of Bill's nod to Catholics saying like, hey, doing this with a secular sponsor, like if you're a Catholic, you want to and you should seek out a priest to do this with. So there is a deep, I think, compatibility there. Some people can steer it in the wrong direction, but I think deep down there's a deep compatibility. with
Yeah.
Catholicism.
I'm curious about your interest in literature, because
Yeah,
I think good literature like is a study of psychology.
it is. Dude,
Like
it is.
I'm reading The Brothers K right now, and I just finished Brideshead Revisited. I fell in love with the
Yeah.
novel. It's
Yes.
like these books
Yeah.
are, it's like such a study of psychology, like even better than
Yeah.
psychology textbooks in many ways, maybe.
Yeah. Yes.
So I'm just interested, what's the one or two or three books for you
Yeah.
that really speak
Yeah.
into the human person?
Yeah. So for me, the texts in particular, the stories in particular that I think were the most amazing psychologically, were actually many of Shakespeare's plays. So the courses I took the most in any sort of particular genre, or I took the most Shakespeare courses. And it seems to me that his insights into the human person and human nature, they're incredibly profound. Like they're incredibly profound. And then not only does he have these insights, but he's able to articulate them in the context of like meter, this masterful meter and rhyme. And it's just, those insights alone would be fascinating, but then to be able to structure them in such a beautiful way. But his ability to capture deep, like profound love, self-sacrificial love, his ability to capture a sort of immature teenage love, his understanding of madness, his understanding of jealousy, envy, revenge, bloodlust. He captures these things. Shakespeare to me should be up there among the great psychologists, given his insights into the human person and human nature. But those are the texts that I was reading and I was just captivated by. He gets people, and he gets different types of people, and he understands how this personality type or how this vice would interact with this vice.
Yeah.
It's really hard to get that in a realistic way. We can sort of like write these cookie cutter, this is how an angry person treats a passive person. But he's able to like explicate through dialogue in a nuanced way how somebody who's filled with revenge or bloodlust might interact with a naive or passive person. And it just was, in my mind, a masterclass in psychology. So those are the texts that, I devoured.
As you're talking, I'm thinking of Rod Dreher a few years ago wrote a book called How Dante Can Save Your Soul.
Yeah.
And it's kind of his story of his healing journey from some sickness, but he was reading Dante. And he was just talking about the power of the story to transform his heart, one, especially in relationship to his family. But in there, he has this little section on basically the nervous system in stories and how narrative affects our brain. And basically, in summary, it seemed like he was trying to make the point that as we're reading it, it's as if we're experiencing what we're reading, right? Because the more primitive parts of our nervous system don't distinguish well between what's in our imagination and what's in our senses.
Yes.
And so just thinking of the power of stories to transform our lives too.
And this is why, I've been talking with, so Scott Hahn and I have been talking a lot about this idea of narrative and story and the Bible. And in some ways, it goes back to, it goes back to prayer. It goes back to our ability to steep ourselves in a story so that it almost becomes ours. Really does offer a bridge to transforming us. And so maybe the difference between, say, Shakespeare and Scripture is that I can enter a story like King Lear or Richard III or Romeo and Juliet, or I can enter it and sort of, it's almost like it's mine. And depending on what character I identify with or how I enter it, I can be moved and shaped and have insights. But Scripture's unique in that it is my story. Like it actually is my story. And to put myself in that story and to steep myself in it and allow myself to be moved and shaped by it. some ways, this is what like discursive meditation, I think, is, where we pick a story, we make ourselves a character in it, and then we say, like, how would I have felt? And do the feelings that are arising in me actually track with how Christ says he feels? He was moved with compassion. I feel angry and bitter, or I feel self-righteous, or I feel, what am I missing? What am I not seeing? And trying to see that in the story so that my reaction can become like Christ's reaction. I mean, I think all this to say, story can profoundly affect us.
Yeah.
Shape us, transform us.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking of like, I know in the 12-step movement, one of the big things is hearing other people's stories, giving a lead, giving a witness almost. And the whole, the big book is followed with probably 100 stories of people's recoveries.
Yes. Stories.
And there's a beauty in the steps that I think matches the structure of the church. If you think of like what the church is giving us as deliverables, I think we have, there's 3 pieces. I think there's sacraments. You got your, go to mass, go to confession. There's, your individual piety, your personal prayer time, your meditation. But then there's also relationships, right? There's the parish. The faith happens in the family, and then it happens in a family of families, which is the parish.
Yes.
So we have these 3 ways, basically, in which we encounter God. Right? We encounter God in the church, in the church's rites, in our personal prayer, right? In our experience of the Holy Spirit. And then we also experience him in one another. And I think the 12-step program also contains all 3 of these elements.
Yes. Agreed. No, I think they map onto each other really nicely. And in that way, for folks who, part of what I was trying to do with the book is for folks who maybe weren't engaging the riches the faith has to offer, you could sort of bring them in the back door, invite them into it in a sort of step-like model.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree. I think that's wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah, can we nerd out a little bit and talk about the nervous system?
Oh, yeah.
So as you're talking about this, like I've spent a ton of time contemplating like the interaction of the external senses, the internal senses, and the nervous system. And like I've been deeply influenced by the work of Dr. Stephen Porges in the polyvagal theory, but also by understanding the central nervous system too, the kind of lateralization of the brain theory, attachment theory. But then also highly influenced by kind of contemporary understandings of trauma, through people like Bessel van der Kolk or Dr. Peter Levine, Dr. Pat Ogden.
Absolutely.
And as I'm sort of mingling all these things in my mind and trying to synthesize and understand for my own practice, but also to teach it, it just strikes me that so much of it, 1, affirms a lot of the wisdom in our tradition that's already there.
Absolutely.
But 2, I think can inform what we're doing even more deeply. In that, I think a lot of what, there's just a ton like lingering onto our minds and onto our practice from the Enlightenment. We don't really think like Catholics. We don't really live like Catholics because we're in this soup that's not Catholic.
Yes.
And like Shakespeare was on the other end of it. Like he was kind of maybe after Christendom, but the world was largely still Christian. And so he was still in that soup. And so the truth just comes out through it.
100%.
But we're kind of in the opposite space. And so I'm so intrigued by, like when we imagine something, and if it's vivid, right?
Yeah.
Our body reacts to it as if it's actually happening to some extent.
And that's good and bad, right? It's bad when it's trauma. And so part of the, working with a lot of veterans, I've done a lot of training with veterans who have PTSD. And one of the problems is this image, these intrusive thoughts. One of the criteria of PTSD is these intrusive thoughts. They're reacting on a physiological level as if the threat and danger is still real and present. So that's like the bad news, right? But the good news is that we can use that to our advantage as well. right? But that is a fascinating, I mean, I'll tell you, Andrew, that and there's all sorts of ways. I mean, the one thing that I'm passionate about sort of in psychology is people get really territorial in psychology. And so, are you doing this kind of therapy? Well, if not, then are you doing this kind of? And so it turns out overwhelmingly, research shows that most of the common therapies are about equally effective for almost all disorders. There's a couple nuances there that are maybe notable, like exposure therapy is particularly helpful for specific phobias. So like, if you're afraid of spiders, going back and talking about your relationship with your parents isn't particularly helpful, right? But for most mental health issues, the major therapies are about equally effective. And so I like to really instill that in my students. But all of that to say, one of the ways I think about therapy, one of the ways I think about what I do is trying to help people take that event that feels so scary and that's causing all this activation and help them, how to say this, deactivate the central nervous system's response to that event. I mean, that is, I actually think it's called the neurotic paradox, but the idea is that the more you avoid something you're afraid of, the more distress it causes you. So I'm terrified of sharks, right? There's all sorts of reasons why, but I'm terrified of sharks. And so a couple of years ago, my son says, "Hey, Dad, we're in Florida. Let's go swim to that buoy." And I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. And he's like, "Come on, Dad. There's people out there already, right?" And I was like, no, I'm not going to do it. The second I said no, my anxiety decreased. Or better, short term. I felt better. But then my mind goes, yeah, thank God you didn't swim out there. Good choice. Man, you just saved yourself. And my anxiety actually, and fear of sharks, increases long term because of my short term avoidance of it. And so one way that I think about therapy is I think that a lot of our problems are actually caused by avoidance of uncomfortable thoughts, memory, feelings. Yeah. And sort of this activation of our central nervous system, right, causes this tremendous fear. And part of what I think we actually need to learn to do is approach the painful thing and learn to hold it and learn to sit with it. And the paradox is oftentimes when we approach the thing we're most afraid of, our anxiety ultimately decreases, our distress decreases. So one way that PTSD is thought about is that it's a disorder of avoidance. That one of the major differentiators between people who get PTSD and those who don't is those who get PTSD are significantly more likely to try to avoid thoughts, feelings, memories, triggers of the traumatic event.
Yeah.
So yeah, all this to say, anyway,
yes.
I think that connection is really clear between memory and central nervous system, imagination and central nervous system.
As you're talking, this strikes me that I've seen a few different studies about, and I think this is maybe one of the reasons why, I think it's a complex issue, but one of the reasons why most therapies are equally as effective is because I think the primary deliverable is the person of the therapist, right? It's the relationship.
The best predictive factor we have. So when we look at sort of what contributes the most to therapeutic change, what contributes most to a positive outcome for a client, it's usually these common factors. They're called common factors, things that are found in every therapy. And overwhelmingly, the best predictor that's within our control. So it turns out in study after study, the best predictor of therapeutic outcome is external factors that we have no control over. Like you got a job, you got a girlfriend, your wife's job got easier and her stress reduced. A whole bunch of things that are outside of our control are actually like the number one driving factor for therapeutic outcome. But like, let's bracket those because we have no control over them. The thing that you have control over that's the biggest predictor of whether or not therapy will be successful, study after study after study, is the therapeutic alliance.
Hmm.
It's our relationship.
Yeah.
It's the quality of the bond and agreement on tasks and goals. Do I feel like we're collaborating and like we both understand the problem the same? We agree on how we're going to work on it. And I feel like you get me. You're safe. And by the way, so then they do variations on this theme. So they have therapists try different therapies.
Huh.
And it turns out that there are certain therapists who are just better at doing any therapy than experts with that therapy. And it's like, why? How could you be better at doing this? Because they're really good at establishing that bond.
Yeah.
There's actually a couple factors they have that are really important to therapeutic outcomes. And one of them is the ability to establish trusting, safe bond with somebody where they're willing to go certain places with you.
Mm.
You're 100% right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would wonder, so like in your book, you talk about primary wounds and secondary wounds.
Yeah.
The fact that there's sort of some wounds that are underneath things and others are more of like a symptom of the deeper thing.
Yeah.
And the deepest wound, the most primary wound is original sin, right?
Absolutely.
And
primordial.
thinking of like that temptation of the serpent, like basically God doesn't really love you. Like he doesn't want you to be like him. Don't trust him. And then once they sin, they hide, right? They hide, they put on fig leaves, they hide from each other. It's that distrust that if they really knew they're not going to love me, they're going to hurt me.
Yep. Yep.
So it just strikes me that the therapeutic relationship speaks truth into the lie of original sin.
Yeah. That's actually great. So, and there's this great passage in the Catechism, I think 397. It says, it's talking about Adam and Eve and original sin. And it says something like, all subsequent sin, after the fall of Adam and Eve, after their disobedience, all subsequent sin is a result of disobedience and a lack of trusting in the goodness of God. That in some ways, all of my sin is characterized in part by but what if you don't want what's best for me? Like, what if you're not trustworthy and good? And that's why I turn and pursue my own things. Like I turn and pursue them precisely because I think like, maybe you don't want what's best for me. Maybe you're not safe. Maybe I'm not going to get what I think I need to make me happy. Maybe you're a liar. And so, Adam and Eve are a microcosm of this. The reason they eat of the fruit is Satan says like, did he really tell you that? Man, I don't know. Maybe he's not as trustworthy and good as you. Like they just begin with distrust God's goodness. And it's God's goodness, ironically, that is the very reason he told them not to eat of that tree. And so in some ways, what I'm always trying to do in the way I do therapy, and I like the way you said it, like it's incarnational in the sense that I'm trying to be a physical manifestation of this goodness and trustworthiness. That so much of our behavior, our pain and suffering, and is driven by a deep and abiding sense that God can't be trusted. He doesn't want what's best for me. And so I better step in the gap.
Yeah.
I better step in the gap and I better take care of me. And so I have all these self-protection strategies. And my self-protection strategies initially help me feel safe and secure and help me feel like I'm getting what I need. But ultimately, they tend to put me in positions to be hurt and harmed by others, to be wounded, and to feel anxious and feel depressed. Yeah.
Yeah. As you were talking about the therapeutic relationship, I couldn't help but think of the concept of neuroception.
Mm-hmm.
Just that our bodies are always detecting, even when we're not conscious of it, and that the whole system of being safe or feeling unsafe and that detection the body is going through is both happening faster than our conscious thought, but then also being filtered through our memories.
Yes.
but in a way, like when we're together, my nervous system's interacting with your nervous system through all these
Yes.
cues. There's a direct communication there, separate from my consciousness. So I'm just thinking of, being safe for someone isn't a matter of technique. Like it isn't a matter of like, hold your face this way and sit in the chair that way and then say these words when they get in. But it's actually like the therapist being regulated and then actually fully being present is the cornerstone.
Have you ever seen these experiments, Andrew? They're called the still face experiments.
It's awful.
Yeah, it's awful. It's awful. It's like, what mother would like do this willingly? But so you have a mom and a child, and mom's interacting, and what you realize is exactly what you're saying is there's this dynamic interaction in the relationship where mom is responding to the child's level of activation, and it's fluid, it's dynamic, and then mom, for 2 minutes, she has to still face the child, not respond. And what's amazing is how quickly the child becomes dysregulated. It screams, pushes, cries, won't look at mom, and then decompensates. It just falls apart emotionally. And part of what that, it's a really nice sort of image of, in some way, I think of therapy, because when I'm trying to be safe for someone, it's dynamic. Yeah, you're right. It's not just like I open my body posture and look them in the eyes and smile. No, for some clients, it might be, I might sort of subtly pick up that they need some gentle smiles. But for others, I might lean in. For others, actually, I might realize that I need to lean out a little bit because to lean in would cause too much activation. So I might start off actually leaning back a little bit, giving them a little bit of space. I mean, I have clients who won't sit back in the chair because they come in and they're so anxious, they're so overwhelmed. They won't sit back on the couch. And so how do I make them feel safe? In some ways, I actually, for them, I'll mirror or I'll model what I want them to see. So I'll sit really far back and kind of sink in, I'll lower the tone of my voice. And so for some clients, I lower my voice. For some clients, I speak louder. It's this dynamic thing, right? I'm communicating with their central nervous system. But I'm big enough and I'm regulated enough, at least in that moment, to be able to sort of adapt and adjust to precisely what they need. And then that begins, you see it. You see moments of when they finally take a deep breath, or when their body finally sinks in the chair a little bit, or when they stop wringing their hands and they just kind of let their hands relax. You see it. I'm taking this in. I really am. If I don't have that with a client, if I don't have safety and trust, if they don't trust my desire for their goodness, I'm generally of the opinion that it's really hard to get far.
Yeah,
it's really hard.
And we do the same thing with God too, because I can't help but think that once Adam and Eve sinned, right? They hid from God, right? Their nervous system was detecting danger in the divine presence. So I think the same is the case for us when we enter into prayer, right? Like if I start to try to pray and I'm distracted, I can't focus, my mind is jumping around, right? I assume that I probably have too much of a sympathetic charge, like I'm dysregulated. There's something going on with my autonomic nervous system. And if I spend time to address what's going on in my physical state, right, by maybe breathing or anchoring on something in the room, or spending some time, journaling out what's going on inside of me or whatever, right? Then I can actually focus on what I want to meditate on. But I think God takes the time to teach us that He's safe.
I do too. I think the problem is, I think the problem is very often, and so some of this stuff is debated and contested. So I don't want to talk about it with too much like authority, absolutely. But are you familiar with Kahneman's System 1, System 2, or fast and slow thing? Okay, so there's this theory of dual cognition, and the idea is that we're processing things on a didactic level, on a rational, didactic, intellectual level. And then there's a sort of, and that sort of slow, deliberate, discursive, right? And then there's a fast system. It's our like intuition. It's predominantly emotional, and it's quick. So you have sort of the slow, deliberate thoughts, and then you've got like the gut, emotional, quick thoughts.
Yeah.
And the theory is that they're operating simultaneously, and sometimes one is more active than the other. And okay. But it's contested sort of philosophically, and okay. But there does seem to be a sense in which we can sit down to pray. And if you ask every student at Franciscan University, who is God? Who is God? They will say God is a good, good Father. He's loving. He's merciful. He's kind and good. And that is the right answer. I mean, and they not like. But if you measure, and I've done like pilot studies where I measure their attachment or their sort of felt security with God, the sort of emotional experience of God, the felt security. If really, really highly anxious attachments or avoidant attachments to God, while simultaneously saying God is good and loving. And so I think what happens, to your point, Andrew, is we can sit down to pray. And yeah, I do think God wants to communicate his safety and security to us. But there's a part of us that goes, yeah, but what about that time when my father left? Where were you then? And what about that time? So my sense is that God wants to speak to our heart. Cor ad cor loquitur. He wants to speak to the depths of our being. But sometimes sort of this discursive, rational mind gets in and puts all sorts of obstacle or barriers up. Well, I don't know, was that just God or was that actually me? Or, I don't know, can God say he really loves me and is he all good because I lost a baby to miscarriage? I mean, all these obstacles and objections are flying around in my head that I think can impede the voice of God. And so, in some ways, and I'm going to try to, I think what you said about calming my nervous system down, one way to maybe hear that voice, God's speaking, God's communicating his safety, is to try to calm my central nervous system down, calm the autonomic arousal down. Because sometimes when I calm that autonomic arousal down, the scurrying thoughts and the constant objections and the constant sort of threat detection calms a little bit. I think another way to do it is to go back into the past and to face some of those things that feel like such objections, that the pain, the suffering, the things that we spend a lot of time, attention, and energy, I think, trying to avoid. I think when we do the work and we face up to them. And I don't know, man, I've developed this program that, I actually forgot about it, so you just said it, but I developed this program called Known, Embraced by the Heart of the Father. And it's basically a 12-week program to help you increase your attachment, your sense of security with God the Father. But one of the exercises we do, and this isn't a lot of things, but we ask people to go back into a particular memory, a core memory, and we ask them to begin by imagining God is hugging you, God is holding you. They're in this intimate embrace with the Father. Maybe he's holding your hand, maybe you're sitting on his lap, maybe. And then you allow him to lead you back into this memory. But you're with him now. You're not alone. Now you're with him. And you allow yourself to try to see what God the Father is saying to you about that experience. Because oftentimes we draw the wrong conclusions about very difficult, painful experiences. Right? This is our semantic memory. We learn the wrong facts. We learn the wrong, facts about how the world works, how people work, and what we need to do is go back into that memory and go back in, and I think then we can hear. So there we are, we're using our imagination like you talked about earlier. I'm in this loving embrace with the Father as I'm going back to this painful place. And from that place, I think we're disposing ourselves to allow him to communicate his safety and love and trustworthiness and goodness.
I love that. Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
Yeah. As you're saying that, like imagination, I think, is involved in every like apperception we ever have. Like there's always a mingling of it, right? So like if we're having this conversation because of my history, right? I know certain things about you. I see certain things about you, but then I imagine certain things about you.
Absolutely.
Right. And a lot of that is formed out of my memory of my past, right? Because my nervous system wants to keep me safe. It's a pattern making machine. Yep. So it's constantly anticipating based on my previous experiences, what's coming up.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yes.
So the issue is kind of, in the first place, I think, is our imagination trying to help us, but not knowing how, right? It's we should have like a gratitude toward it. But on the other hand, we also need to like lead it in the right direction. And so it makes perfect sense that we would use that imagination, basically like teach it. And with that, as you were talking, I couldn't help but think of, like in classical thought, they actually made a distinction between two different functions of our reason, between intellectus and ratio.
Yeah.
And I've kind of like stumbled around in this a little bit in my thinking, but I'm trying to do a deep dive on the topic right now. And with that, so Dr. Conrad Bars, you familiar with him? A Catholic psychiatrist whom
healing your emotion
of integrating. Yep. I'll put all the stuff we're talking about. I have previous episodes on, so I'll throw those in the show notes for the audience. So anyone that's listening that wants to like catch up on these themes, I'll put it in the show notes with the times, so you can go back to previous episodes. So in one of his books, he draws a connection. He felt like there was a connection between intellectus, this kind of more intuitive reasoning, the more kind of simple of the mind just coming to something, and the concupiscible passions, meaning our attractions toward things or too much or too little, and then a connection between our ratio, our reason, our kind of discursive thinking, and our concupiscible passions. One of the reasons I'm doing the deep dive is I'm not sure he completely understood those terms in light of St. Thomas's teaching. So I like really need to dig in and make sure I don't like say wrong things, right?
Yeah. Do you know Dr. Kevin Majors is a psychiatrist up in Boston. He has a podcast called The Golden Hour. Okay. And he has a program called Optimal Work. Yeah. He's doing a lot of neat work. Devout Catholic. He has an article. You'd have to Google it, but he has an article where he basically says, look, Bars gets Thomas's understanding of the passions wrong, and here's how, and here's why. Okay. He's a fascinating guy. He's a psychiatrist. He's a medical doctor. He's one of the few psychiatrists that I know that actually practices psychotherapy. So he's been trained at, no, he's actually been trained at Beck's, the CBT Institute. Oh. So he does a lot of work. Yeah. So old school in the sense that he's doing therapy, but he does CBT, but he also knows theology. I mean, the story about him is, and maybe it's hagiographical, but the story is that he read the Summa when he was in high school. And I think he at least has a pretty solid knowledge of St. Thomas. And so his article out there, if you Google it, he has an article where he suggests that Bars doesn't quite understand the passions correctly.
Okay, I need to read that. I realized when you said Optimal Work that I follow him on YouTube, and he's on like my like dream guest list, I think too. So I'm gonna have to go after him.
He's great.
See if you can
reach out to him. And if you can't, he works with a guy, Sharif Yunus. Does a lot of work on Optimal Work. Okay. With Kevin, and so not that Sharif is like Kevin, but Sharif would also be a great guest. Okay, cool. I'll go for both. And that I think is more time maybe than Kevin's incredibly busy. But to your point, I think there's a lot there. And I want to personally do a deeper dive into sort of this Thomistic framework, Aristotelian Thomistic framework, and then see, maybe do different therapies touch different dimensions? Like, does CBT sort of focus on like ratio, and maybe internal family systems, or emotion-focused therapy really focuses on the passions, and I don't know, acceptance and commitment therapy, these third wave mindfulness-based therapies, maybe they actually are some, like, I want to see if we can situate where some of the modern therapies touch a sort of classical anthropology, like understanding the human person, so we can get a better sense of maybe how and why they're working, at least from a classic Thomistic anthropology.
Yep.
And then see if there's anything too that they might be able to add. I mean, I think all the really great Thomists who I know will also say, look, I mean, St. Thomas has so much there, but connections can be made and things can be advanced, and there are things he might not have recognized. We know things now empirically, and we try to carve out space for them in a Thomistic psychology. And so I think there can be a bi-directional relationship, but I'm really interested in sort of a deeper dive into that myself.
Yeah, we'll have to stay in touch about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I just finished a great article on it, and yeah, there's a ton there. I'm curious about, so we have the autonomic nervous system shifting between states of safety and danger. Right? We're always perceiving and shifting, but then we also have our central nervous system, our brain.
Yep.
And I think one of the theories that might be related to that kind of dual processing idea, or the speed at which, our nervous system is processing things, might be, and I know this is to some extent not a truthful idea, but the old theory of the lateralization of the brain, the kind of old right brain, left brain idea.
Sure.
But I think what comes out of that is basically this kind of dual processor notion, where the one side of the brain is running more on attachment, love, running on relationships, maybe laying down more of the implicit memory.
Yeah.
And the other side of the brain is more involved in the discursive thinking, the rational thinking, the language. And on that side, we're laying down more of the explicit memory.
Yeah.
And with that, a great book that I've mentioned on the show before, The Other Half of Church, they just point out the fact that so much of what we do in the church is focusing on the side of the brain dealing with all the discursive thinking. It's like, read the book, do the Bible study, listen to this lecture, listen to the podcast. I mean, not to condemn what I'm doing right here, but
shoot yourself.
but oftentimes people are coming to these materials hoping that their behaviors change, right? They're hoping to be able to show up differently when they're stressed out, that at night when they're uncomfortable, they don't turn to whatever online, or the next time their kid freaks out, they don't yell at them, or that they don't overeat when they're tired and lonely at the end of the day, or we have all these just very practical and very human struggles. But so many of the tools that the church offers us don't really address the part of our nervous system that drives that behavior.
Yeah. And I wonder if that's it's probably twofold, right? I mean, there's probably a broader issue here that's like, in order to do that requires like deep personal connection.
Yeah.
And that's vulnerable and scary for a lot there people. Mm-hmm. And so in some sense, I mean, look, this is the greatest plug in some ways for your own healing. Like, there are certain things you won't be able to communicate to others if you want to evangelize. If you're sort of constantly dysregulated or in a state of sort of fight or flight or threat and distress, because you won't be able to communicate that safety. And as a result of that, you'll want to keep it intellectual. Look, if I'm worried about you hurting me in some way, if I come into this podcast and I'm worried that you're going to try to have a gotcha moment, or you're going to, try to make me look like a fool, I'm going intellectual.
Yeah.
This is scary. You can hurt me here. I'm vulnerable here, but this, we can do intellectual jujitsu all day, right?
Yeah.
And so in a lot of ways, and this sounds like, the old sort of psychodynamic or psychoanalytical defense mechanisms, but intellectualizing keeps a nice space between me and the other, such that I can communicate what I need to and not risk being hurt or drawn into a space of vulnerability. The problem is, like, when you really love somebody, like, inherent in that is allowing yourself to be drawn into a place or space where you could be hurt.
Yeah.
It risks, there's a risk involved with loving somebody. And what's really difficult about Christianity, about Catholicism, is we're called to love. But, like, gosh, that can hurt, like, a lot. It can hurt a lot. All sorts of situations. You allow yourself to care about others. You allow yourself to be seen, and to see others. That means that there can be pain and distress, and so I think a lot of us are just uncomfortable with that. And so all that to say, that was a really long-winded way of saying, I'm not sure it's the church as much as it is us, right, in that the church's tools and what it offers are generally probably aimed at the heart.
Yeah.
But the way we bring them to others, the way that I think we intellectualize them, or priests intellectualize them, or whoever's giving us these goods tends to keep a distance, precisely because, could you imagine if your priest really loved everyone in the parish?
Yeah.
Be exhausted. You'd
be like Jesus.
How do you go to bed? Yeah, right? It might be so difficult that you experience agony.
Yeah.
Right? It might be like the way a dad feels at night when I think about my 6 kids and how there's certainly no way I'm able to meet all of their needs emotionally and spiritually and physically. And I'm overwhelmed by my sense of inadequacy, and, like, I've allowed myself to be drawn into this story of my daughter who's struggling in this way, and the story of my son who's struggling this way, and the 4-year-old who just wants chocolate chips and rainbow sprinkles. And, like, it's, you open yourself up. It's easy to be a dad and to take a 20,000-foot view and to approach everything intellect. Son, you need to take this to prayer. Have you asked our Lord to help you? Like, have you prayed a rosary? Daughter. That's, like, different than being like, come here, babe. And, like, having her curl up in my lap and saying, let's ask God for help. Let's ask him. Do you want me to lead, or do you want to lead? Now all of a sudden I'm like, it's going to cost. My heart's engaged. And I'm afraid for her. And I'm afraid that maybe God isn't going to show up in the way I want him to in her life. And now I'm like, and so all that to say, I think you're right. I think, not to create a false dichotomy here, but I think God predominantly, it's faith, hope, and love. St. Paul tells us. But, like, the one that remains, the one that persists, is love. Like, and in some ways, we are a religion of love, and that has to be rightly understood, obviously, and there's all sorts of caveats about what love is and isn't. Yeah. But it is a relationship of love and about falling in love more deeply with Christ, his church. And that, man, that's not just an intellectual exercise. Knowledge can aid love. The more I know my wife, the more I'm able to love her, and the better, right? But knowledge alone is insufficient. But we can fool ourselves in thinking that our knowledge is love. Yeah. I know so much I know the early church fathers, I know the Greek, I can read the Bible in Koine Greek, I can read the Vulgate, I know all of the Eastern fathers. That doesn't mean you love. Yeah. Love is to give myself over to the other. And that, man, is risky and scary.
Yeah, that's the incarnation. It's like God. How did God become vulnerable to us other than to become a man?
Yes.
And like so much of what doesn't make sense in the scripture, I think makes sense in light of this, right? Like something difficult, like the messianic secret, like Jesus goes to extreme lengths to try to basically not have a lot of people around. Like he wanders off into the wilderness by himself. He like doesn't take the momentum wave when people are chanting for him and following him. He's constantly telling people not to tell about what's happened.
Yeah.
And when I enter into this and ponder it, it just strikes me that like, it's because Jesus, I believe, is trying to give the apostles a new attachment, right? Jesus, by living with those 12 men for 3 years, is reconfiguring their nervous systems.
100%. Safety, trustworthiness, goodness. I mean, I think about what I mean, I mentioned this a little bit before we started recording, but I've got this idea that's been percolating a little bit. So attachment is about felt security.
Mm-hmm.
It's activated in times of threat or distress. And there's some marks of attachment. So commonly we talk about proximity seeking. I want to be close to my caregiver or a safe, secure base. I want to be close to the caregiver. I want to view them as a safe haven. I'll experience attachment anxiety, and I'll view them as a safe base from which to explore the world. Like the marks of a secure attachment: proximity seeking, safe haven, attachment anxiety, and safe base. I think the liturgy is fascinating. So when you go to Mass, one of the first things that happens, we bless ourselves, opening prayer, penitential rite. I'm a grievous sinner. And I beat my breast and I say, I'm a grievous sinner. And all of a sudden, I think if we're living the liturgy, if we're present there, we should have a moment that's like, oh no, uh-oh. I think threat and distress should immediately heighten. Like, left to your own devices, just from last week, just from 7 days ago, if you're really able to enter into those words and say them, like, you know who you are, and you know what you're about, and you know what you're capable of, and that's kind of terrifying. And so threat and distress immediately arises. And I think what happens in the liturgy is we have this activation, right, of our attachment behavioral system because we've just experienced threat. You're a sinner, and on your own, you're screwed. If I can say that, but you're in trouble.
Yeah.
And so now all of a sudden, what does God do throughout the liturgy? He meets us in his word. So one way you communicate safety and security to a child is through the tone of your voice.
Yeah.
And the words you say. And so we get the liturgy of the word. Almost right away, we get the liturgy of the word, which, I don't know, if you had to summarize the liturgy of the word, it's something like, I'm here. I'm with you. You're mine. I've got a plan. I want to be among you. I want to be, right? And I think in some way, all of the stories all point to like that narrative in some way, right?
Yeah.
You're mine. You're safe. Got you. Trust. So we're in this attachment space because we're a sinner and we're in trouble, and God's saying, like, you're okay. You're okay. You're okay. You're okay. I've got this. I'm bigger. I'm stronger. I've got this. And then proximity seeking, where do we get this in the liturgy? Well, like in the Eucharist, like God comes to it. Like my daughter comes to me and wraps her arm around my leg when she's scared, or she climbs into bed with me at night and she presses her body against me. Well, in the Eucharist, we get an even more intimate proximity seeking.
Yeah.
God's like, I'm spiritually united to you in a way that's so profound, closer to you than you are to yourself. And then you say, well, where's the using the world as the safe, secure base? Well, the end of every liturgy, we say, go forth. There's a sending out into the world, but always with the ability to look back and see that our caregiver, our loving, safe, big, gentle caregiver is right there. Well, I can go into the world with utter confidence and look back. Oh, there you are. I'm okay. Oh, there you are. It's what my daughter does when we go to the park. She takes 10 steps forward, and then all the kids start playing, and she looks back like, am I okay? Okay, maybe it's okay. And she'll go a little further. Am I okay? And we get sent out at the end of the Mass with the ability to look back and say, am I okay? You're okay. still here. Anyway, I think the whole liturgy, we call the church mother. Where does the liturgy is taking place in the heart of the church, right? In the heart of our mother. It's just this like, we're in the womb of the mother even maybe. Like it's just, there's so much symbolism and imagery, I think, around attachment, even within the heart of the liturgy.
Yeah.
But you're right. Our Lord wants to heal. Original sin maybe in some way can be conceptualized as an attachment wound.
Yeah.
One that's self-imposed. Come to view God as unsafe, untrustworthy, not good, right? And Eve gives that to Adam, and Adam reinforces it with Eve. And then God spends all this time saying, no, you can trust me. I'm here. I'm safe. But I think we need to use our imaginations. I think we need to live the liturgy. We need to like be fully present to it.
Yeah.
To allow it to encounter us. Or how to say it, to allow us to deeply encounter it.
Yeah.
For what it is. But also, I think we need to use our imaginations and steep ourselves in these images of security and safety. Saint Therese has this image she uses. When she was made novice mistress, she said, Lord, like, I'm not able to do this. I'm not big enough. I'm not capable enough. And she said, here's the image I used. I imagine burying my head in the shoulder of the Father, and he would give me all of the graces for the sisters. And without ever turning around to look at them, I would just hand the graces he had for them behind me. And she used this image to create a sense of safety and security. She steeped herself in it. And I think we need to do this. I think we need to use our imaginations to steep ourselves in images of the Father that heal that wound.
Yeah. Yeah. And
I talked so much there, Andrew. You're so patient. You're a saint.
That's good. So you're like, I have like notes, and you're taking the conversation where I was going to. So I'm like, you're doing all the work. It's wonderful. So as you were talking, I have paragraph 239 of the Catechism here.
Yes.
It says, by calling God Father, the language of faith indicates two main things: that God is first origin of everything and transcendent authority, and that he has at the same time goodness and loving care for all his children. God's parental tenderness can also be expressed by the image of motherhood, which emphasizes God's immanence, the intimacy between creator and creature. The language of faith thus draws on the human experience of parents, who are in a way the first representatives of God for man. But this experience also tells us that human parents are fallible and can disfigure the face of fatherhood and motherhood.
So often do.
Yeah.
Look, so much of the work I do, particularly when it dovetails with some of the God stuff, so much of the work I do, look, we have tremendous loyalty to our parents.
Yeah.
Well, sort of a sign of a secure attachment is actually the ability to talk honestly about the deficits and shortcomings of a parent. What most people do is say something like, I had really great parents. I know they love me. That's always like the first stage of therapy is like, I had really good parents. I know they love me. They would do anything for me. I'm like, no, I know. But like so much of the things we learn and they're taught to us by our parents implicitly. It's not like our parents are oftentimes saying, sometimes they are, sometimes not so great parents teach us the wrong thing explicitly, but very often our parents unintentionally teach us things that they're not trying to communicate but do. When parents shut down certain feelings or emotions, when parents overly praise us for getting really good grades or certain achievements, kids can sometimes learn, I'm lovable when I do this. It's like, and that's not what the parents trying to communicate, but they unintentionally communicate it. I know parents who have said to their kids, oh my gosh, you got a 93? That's great. Oh, wow, so great. I bet you could get a 97. And the parent thought, I'm encouraging my child. And the child thought, I can never live up to my parents' expectations.
Yeah.
And so often, unintentionally, parents disfigure this image of the Father. And it's, if I think about it too much, it's really scary as a parent to think about all the ways that I'm unintentionally communicating untruths about God the Father to my kids.
Yeah.
And what it does is, if I allow it, and if I'm in a good place personally, it drives me to my knees in faith and hope and love.
Yeah.
When I'm not in a good place, I just ignore it and I avoid it, and I probably act out of, central nervous system around, and then I'm a worse father.
Yeah. Well, just the idea that I can't criticize my parents, it betrays the truth, right? Because it means that I learned that my parents aren't big enough to be criticized.
Andrew, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. A parent that is mature and healthy and should be able to hear the criticisms of their child and hold it and still feel okay. We call this, the old psychodynamic term is a holding environment. Parents are holding environments.
Yeah.
They signal that I can hold all of you. Those pieces that feel chaotic and unruly, that feel big, that feel unacceptable, I can hold it. I can handle it. And it doesn't shake or destroy or dysregulate me. But so oftentimes as parents, what we actually signal is, when you do that, I'm not okay.
Yeah.
The kid learns, Dad's not safe in this particular situation or regard. And I see this in my own parenting. I do. And, but that's exactly, and so part of therapy is creating a space with me where they feel willing to take the risk of criticizing their parent.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I know the enemy plays spiritual jujitsu with us. So, the second we start to recognize our parents' failings, then his next move is for you to get you to focus on your own failings, right?
Yes.
So this is just his common move sequence. The left hook, then the right uppercut that he tries on us is deny what your parents did to you. Oh, and then, by the way, you're such a terrible parent. So then they hit you from the other direction. And I think we just got to keep just letting those glance off.
And sometimes what I'll do too is I find that when I'm honest, this is one of the steps in the book, is being honest with yourself about who you are and where you are. And rather than having to pretend like I'm further ahead, or to honestly accept in humility where I am, allows me to turn to God with like a child, like with the right sort of disposition, which is sort of like a childlike, I can't do this. Like I'm really struggling in this particular way, and I can't seem to get over this, and I need your help. It's like when my daughter needs help scooping ice cream out of a container. Right? Sometimes she'll say, she's 4 and she's trying to be competent in things. She'll say, "I got it, Dad. I got it. I'm like, "You don't, sister." You know what I mean? Like, but you're gonna find out in a second you don't, and you're gonna want that ice cream, and you're gonna ask for my help. And so sometimes when I'm honest about where I am, and I'll say, look, I'm not the worst parent. I'm not. So I'm not going to listen to the lie of Satan, which is like, you're the worst.
Yeah.
Your kids are going to be screwed up forever. The problem with Satan's story is it's almost always exaggerated or catastrophized.
Yeah, absolutes.
But the truth is, like, I'm a fallible parent and I do hurt my kids and there may be some consequences. And if I am willing to accept that in humility and truth, then I turn to God and say, help me, please help me. I want to get better, but I'm really struggling here. Yeah. Like I know I'm not meeting this particular kid's needs in the way they need them met. Or I know my fear, my shame, my embarrassment, please help me. I turn to God the right way when I'm honest about who I am and what I am and how I am. But the key is to not buy the excessive story that Satan often tells.
Yeah.
You know?
Sure. So I'll land the plane here.
Yeah.
I have like 500 more things to talk about.
I know, man. Well, we have to do this again. We will do this again. I'd love that. Really would.
Yeah. Well, Matt, thank you so much for being on the show. I want everyone in the audience to consider going and getting his book. I just lost the name of the book, of course. It is
Finding Freedom in Christ.
Finding in Freedom in Christ, Healing Life's Hurts. There's a great synthesis of like all kinds of great psychological theories with a bunch of great theology. And it's very clean how you did it. I love it. So I highly recommend it because then it becomes very practical too. So go to get a copy of the book. If you feel like you need some help, I'll put links in the show notes to Dr. Breuninger's practice, but then I'll also put links to other good Catholic counseling services in the links in the show notes. And with that, everyone, thanks for joining us for Physically Spiritual. God bless. Thank you so much for joining me for Physically Spiritual. I'm grateful for every single minute of the show you've watched. If you haven't yet, please like, follow, subscribe, and share the show. Help others find this great content. If you love what you hear here and want to help it to happen, please consider becoming a patron of the show. You can do that by going to physicallyspiritual.com. There's different giving levels. And one of the great perks you'll get is to enter into a deep dive with me. So every month to the patrons, I publish a video where I talk about what I'm reading, what I'm considering for upcoming shows, my thought process, and what guests are coming up. So God bless everyone, and thank you for joining us.